Since 1945, humanity has possessed the ability to destroy itself completely in a matter of hours. The nuclear arsenals of major powers contain enough firepower to end civilization several times over. You might think that weapons capable of ending the world would be protected by foolproof safety systems and careful protocols. Then there were these incidents, which proved that nuclear war has almost started because of computer glitches, misread radar, confused bears, and one memorable occasion involving the moon. Buckle up for a terrifying masterclass in how close we've come to extinction, often for the stupidest reasons imaginable. 1. On September 26, 1983, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov single-handedly prevented nuclear war by deciding that his computer system was wrong when it reported 5 American nuclear missiles heading toward the Soviet Union. Petrov was the duty officer at a Soviet early warning command center when alarms indicated an American first strike was underway. Soviet protocol required him to immediately report the attack to his superiors, which would have triggered a retaliatory launch. But Petrov reasoned that an American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5, and decided the system was malfunctioning. He reported a false alarm instead of an attack. Investigation later revealed the satellite had been fooled by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. Petrov's decision to trust his judgment over his computers saved approximately 300 million lives that night, though he was initially reprimanded for improper documentation of the incident. 2. In 1979, NORAD computers indicated that a massive Soviet nuclear attack was underway, with over 2,000 missiles heading toward the United States. Nuclear bombers were scrambled, missile silos prepared for launch, and the National Emergency Airborne Command Post took off to ensure presidential survival. For 6 terrifying minutes, America prepared for nuclear war. The cause of the false alarm was eventually traced to a training tape that had been accidentally loaded into the operational computer system. Someone had inserted a simulation of a Soviet attack into a computer that was supposed to be monitoring for real attacks. The mistake was discovered only when radar stations confirmed no missiles were actually in the air. A 46-cent computer chip had nearly ended human civilization. 3. On January 25, 1995, Russian President Boris Yeltsin became the first world leader to activate a nuclear briefcase in response to a potential attack. Russian radar had detected what appeared to be a submarine-launched nuclear missile heading toward Moscow from the Norwegian Sea. Yeltsin had just minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. The missile was actually a Norwegian scientific rocket studying the Northern Lights. Norway had notified Russia weeks earlier, but the message never reached the right people. The rocket's trajectory mimicked that of a Trident nuclear missile, triggering the alert. Yeltsin waited until the rocket landed harmlessly in the ocean rather than launching. The world nearly ended because of a lost memo about weather research. 4. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, a Soviet submarine commander named Valentin Savitsky prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo at American warships that were dropping depth charges on his vessel. Soviet submarines had been ordered to maintain radio silence, meaning Savitsky didn't know whether war had already started on the surface. His submarine had been underwater so long that carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high, and crew members were fainting from heat exhaustion. Savitsky reportedly shouted, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all." Launching required agreement from 3 officers, and one, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Arkhipov convinced Savitsky to surface and await orders instead of starting World War III. One man's refusal to follow his captain's order saved the world. 5. In November 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83 that simulated a coordinated nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, including realistic communication procedures and escalation scenarios. Soviet leadership, already paranoid about American intentions under President Reagan, interpreted the exercise as potential cover for an actual first strike. The KGB ordered its stations worldwide to watch for signs of imminent attack, and Soviet nuclear forces were placed on heightened alert. Some historians believe the Soviets came closer to launching a preemptive strike during Able Archer than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The exercise ended on November 11th, and the world never knew how close it had come to nuclear war because NATO decided to practice nuclear war too realistically. 6. On October 27, 1962, the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American U-2 spy plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, while on an air sampling mission to detect nuclear tests. Soviet MiGs scrambled to intercept, and American F-102 fighters armed with nuclear-tipped missiles launched to rescue the U-2. The F-102 pilots had authority to use their nuclear weapons at their own discretion. Soviet commanders could have interpreted the incursion as a pre-attack reconnaissance mission and launched their own response. The U-2 pilot realized his navigation error and escaped Soviet airspace. Fighter jets armed with nuclear weapons had nearly started World War III because one pilot got lost on the same day the submarine incident occurred. 7. In 1960, NORAD's early warning system at Thule, Greenland detected a massive Soviet missile attack with a 99.9% confidence rating. Bombers were scrambled, and commanders prepared for nuclear war. Officers contacted Thule directly to confirm the attack and discovered the radar system had interpreted the moon rising over Norway as a Soviet missile barrage. The radar had been designed to look for objects moving toward the United States at high speed, and apparently nobody had considered that the moon does that every night. The system's high confidence rating came from detecting a very large object moving in a consistent trajectory, which the moon certainly was. The world almost ended because engineers forgot about the moon. 8. In 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 hydrogen bombs broke apart over Goldsboro, North Carolina. One bomb's parachute deployed, and it landed relatively intact. The other plummeted to Earth and began its arming sequence. Of the 4 safety mechanisms designed to prevent accidental detonation, 3 failed. A single low-voltage switch was all that prevented a 4-megaton explosion, 250 times more powerful than Hiroshima, from detonating over the eastern United States. The bomb's uranium core was never recovered. It remains buried in North Carolina farmland to this day. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later admitted the weapon came closest to detonating by accident of any American nuclear bomb. 9. On November 9, 1979, NORAD computers again indicated a Soviet attack, this time showing 250 missiles heading toward America. Strategic Air Command ordered B-52 bombers into the air and prepared Minuteman missiles for launch. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was awoken and told he had 3 to 7 minutes to decide whether to wake President Carter and recommend a response. Brzezinski was about to call Carter when he received word that other detection systems showed no missiles. The false alarm was traced to the same cause as the earlier incident. A training tape had again been loaded into the wrong computer. The same mistake that had nearly caused nuclear war 6 months earlier had happened again because nobody had fixed the underlying system problem. 10. In 1958, a B-47 bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb on Mars Bluff, South Carolina, fortunately without its fissile core installed. The bomb's conventional explosives detonated, creating a crater 75 feet wide and 35 feet deep, destroying a house and injuring 6 people. The bomb had been accidentally released when the pilot grabbed the emergency release handle while trying to resolve a fault light. The Air Force paid $54,000 in damages to the affected family. While this particular bomb couldn't have produced a nuclear explosion, the incident demonstrated that American nuclear weapons could be accidentally dropped on American citizens through simple cockpit errors. 11. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, a bear somehow climbed over a fence at a military base in Duluth, Minnesota, triggering an intruder alarm. At nearby Volk Field in Wisconsin, the alarm was connected to the wrong siren. Instead of signaling a security breach, it indicated nuclear war had begun. Pilots sprinted to their F-106 interceptors, armed with nuclear missiles, and prepared to take off and attack Soviet targets. An officer in a truck raced onto the runway, flashing his lights to stop the planes before they took off for World War III. The bear was never caught, and nobody knows if it understood how close it came to ending human civilization. 12. In 1968, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed on the ice near Thule Air Base in Greenland after a fire broke out on board. The conventional explosives in all 4 bombs detonated on impact, scattering plutonium across the ice and into the water below. The crash contaminated a wide area with radioactive material and required a massive cleanup effort. Danish workers involved in the cleanup later suffered elevated rates of cancer. The Thule incident demonstrated that flying nuclear weapons over Allied nations wasn't quite as safe as the Pentagon had assured everyone, and contributed to Denmark banning nuclear weapons from its territory. 13. In 1966, a B-52 collided with a refueling tanker over Palomares, Spain, scattering 4 hydrogen bombs across the Spanish countryside and Mediterranean Sea. One bomb landed in a tomato field, another in a dry riverbed. Conventional explosives in 2 bombs detonated, contaminating the area with plutonium. The 4th bomb fell into the Mediterranean and wasn't recovered for 80 days. The incident required American forces to remove 1,400 tons of contaminated soil and ship it to South Carolina for storage. The Spanish were understandably upset that America had accidentally dropped 4 nuclear weapons on their country during what was supposed to be a routine refueling mission. 14. On October 25, 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a guard at an Air Force base in Duluth, Minnesota, saw a figure climbing the security fence and shot at it. The gunfire triggered the sabotage alarm, which was wired to alarms at all nearby bases. At Volk Field, the alarm activated, but it was wired to the wrong indicator, signaling a nuclear attack instead of sabotage. Pilots again scrambled to nuclear-armed aircraft before the error was discovered. The intruder at Duluth turned out to be another bear. 2 separate bear-related incidents during the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly triggered nuclear war, suggesting perhaps military bases should have better bear defenses during international crises. 15. In 1980, a B-52 caught fire while sitting on a runway in Grand Forks, North Dakota, loaded with nuclear weapons. Firefighters couldn't approach because of the risk of weapons detonation, and the fire burned for hours while commanders worried the heat might trigger an explosion. The weapons safety systems held, but the incident revealed that a runway fire could potentially cause a nuclear detonation on American soil. The Air Force's solution was to better protect nuclear weapons from fire rather than question whether keeping live nuclear weapons on constant runway alert was perhaps too dangerous. 16. In 1961, the Soviet Union's first nuclear-armed submarine, K-19, suffered a catastrophic reactor failure during its first patrol. The cooling system failed and reactor temperature began rising toward meltdown. Without a backup cooling system, the crew improvised repairs while being exposed to fatal radiation doses. 8 sailors died within weeks from radiation poisoning, and many more died in subsequent years. The submarine's nuclear missiles remained armed throughout the crisis. If the reactor had exploded or the submarine had sunk uncontrollably, the consequences could have included nuclear missile detonation or Soviet attribution of the loss to American attack. 17. In 1956, a B-47 carrying nuclear weapons disappeared over the Mediterranean Sea and was never found. The aircraft was carrying 2 nuclear capsules in a carrying case, and despite extensive searches, neither the plane, its crew, nor its nuclear cargo was ever recovered. The bombs presumably remained somewhere on the Mediterranean seabed. This was just one of numerous broken arrow incidents, the military term for accidents involving nuclear weapons, that demonstrated the inherent risks of constantly moving nuclear weapons around the world. 18. In 1968, a Soviet Golf-class submarine carrying 3 nuclear ballistic missiles sank in the Pacific Ocean northwest of Hawaii. The Soviets didn't know the sub's exact location, but the Americans did. They had been tracking it and recorded its implosion on underwater microphones. The CIA launched a covert operation called Project Azorian to recover the submarine and its missiles. They built a massive ship disguised as a deep-sea mining vessel and attempted to lift the submarine from 3 miles down. The sub broke apart during recovery, and the Soviets never learned America had attempted to steal their nuclear missiles from the ocean floor. The incident remained classified for decades. 19. In 1983, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, already paranoid about American intentions after President Reagan's evil empire rhetoric and military buildup, became convinced that NATO's Able Archer exercise was cover for a real attack, partially because the Soviets' own war plans called for disguising a first strike as an exercise. The KGB launched Operation Resen, a Russian acronym for Nuclear Missile Attack, to detect signs of imminent American attack, and agents worldwide were ordered to monitor blood bank activities, since blood supplies would be stockpiled before a war. Watch for unusual patterns at military bases, track movements of government officials, and monitor lights in key buildings after hours. The operation continued for years, generating massive amounts of intelligence that was then interpreted through a paranoid lens. Soviet intelligence analysts interpreted routine American activities as possible attack preparation, creating a persistent backdrop of nuclear tension based on projected paranoia rather than actual intelligence. Every late-night light in the Pentagon became possible evidence of war planning. 20. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the USS Beale began dropping practice depth charges on a Soviet submarine it had detected near the American Naval Quarantine Line. Not realizing the submarine was armed with a nuclear torpedo capable of destroying an entire carrier battle group. The depth charges weren't intended to destroy the submarine, only to force it to surface for identification, as per standard naval practice. But to the crew of submarine B-59, suffering in unbearable heat with failing life support systems after days underwater, the explosions directly above them sounded like full-scale warfare. The crew had been out of contact with Moscow for days and had no way of knowing whether war had started above them. This was the same submarine where Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize a nuclear launch. The American surface fleet had no idea how close they came to being vaporized, because they decided to harass a submarine with weapons they considered non-lethal, never imagining the submarine might respond with nuclear weapons. 21. In 1961, a B-52 crashed in Yuba City, California, while carrying 2 nuclear weapons after an uncontrollable fuel leak forced the crew to abandon the aircraft. The weapons' safety systems prevented detonation when the bomber struck the ground, but the incident led to the disturbing discovery that the safety mechanisms were less robust than the Air Force had previously believed and publicly claimed. The Air Force had been flying nuclear weapons over populated American areas for years without fully understanding how easily they could detonate accidentally under certain impact conditions. The crash led to improved safety designs and triggered a review of other incidents that had been classified, revealing a pattern of close calls that painted a much more dangerous picture than the public had been told. 22. In 1964, a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile exploded in its silo in Searcy, Arkansas, after a maintenance technician accidentally dropped a socket from a socket wrench 70 feet down the silo, where it punctured the missile's pressurized fuel tank. The hypergolic fuel mixture ignited, causing an explosion that killed 1 airman and injured 21 others. The 9-megaton warhead, the most powerful single weapon in the American arsenal at the time, with 600 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb, was thrown 200 feet from the silo by the explosion, but didn't detonate. The incident demonstrated that America's most powerful nuclear weapons could be disabled or potentially triggered by dropped tools, which wasn't particularly reassuring about the overall safety of the nuclear arsenal. The disaster was later documented in the book and documentary Command and Control. 23. In 1957, a C-124 transport aircraft lost power over the Atlantic Ocean and jettisoned 2 nuclear weapon cores to lighten the aircraft enough to stay airborne and avoid crashing into the sea. The cores were released somewhere off the coast of New Jersey and sank to the ocean floor, where they remain to this day, never recovered despite search efforts. This was considered acceptable at the time because the weapon's conventional explosive components weren't attached, meaning the cores couldn't produce a nuclear explosion. But it did mean nuclear material was simply dropped into the Atlantic Ocean, because a plane had engine trouble, which subsequent generations considered less acceptable than 1950s military planners apparently did. 24. In October 1962, during the tensest phase of the Cuban Missile Crisis, American radar operators briefly believed they detected a missile launch from Cuba toward the United States. The detection was tracked for several minutes, with officers preparing to report an incoming attack before being identified as a software error caused by a test tape. The same type of error that would later cause the 1979 false alarms. During the most dangerous nuclear crisis in history, American systems were confusing test data with actual attacks due to inadequate safeguards, and only luck prevented a response before the error was discovered. The incident demonstrated that even during moments when nuclear war seemed imminent, the systems designed to detect attacks were fundamentally unreliable. 25. In 1968, the nuclear-powered submarine USS Scorpion sank in the Atlantic Ocean under circumstances that remain partially classified more than 50 years later. The submarine carried 2 nuclear torpedoes that presumably remain with the wreckage nearly 2 miles below the surface. The Navy's investigation suggested the sinking resulted from a torpedo malfunction, possibly one of Scorpion's own Mark 37 torpedoes, activating in its tube and either exploding or forcing the submarine to dive beyond crush depth while trying to evade its own weapon. The loss of the submarine and its 99 crew members demonstrated the risks inherent in sending nuclear weapons into extreme environments, where accidents can't be investigated, remediated, or even fully understood. The wreck was located but has never been recovered, and the nuclear torpedoes remain on the ocean floor. 26. In 1966, American forces in West Germany briefly lost a nuclear artillery shell during a training exercise. Simply misplaced it somewhere in the German countryside. The shell was eventually found, but the incident revealed that nuclear weapons small enough to be fired from artillery could also be small enough to lose track of entirely. The same exercises that were supposed to demonstrate NATO's nuclear capability and deter Soviet aggression created opportunities for nuclear weapons to simply go missing, potentially falling into unknown hands or being forgotten in locations where they could later be discovered by civilians. 27. In 1950, a B-36 bomber had engine trouble over British Columbia, Canada, during a training mission and jettisoned its Mark IV nuclear bomb to reduce weight and maintain altitude. The weapon's conventional explosives detonated on impact, destroying the bomb and scattering debris over a wide area of Canadian wilderness. The fissile core had been removed before the flight, standard practice at the time, but the incident was America's first acknowledged nuclear weapon accident and demonstrated that even weapons designed with safety in mind could be lost through routine mechanical failures. The Canadian government was informed, though the public wasn't told for years. The incident site became known as the Broken Arrow location, lending the name to all subsequent nuclear weapons accidents. 28. In 1965, an A-4E Skyhawk attack aircraft rolled off the deck of the USS Ticonderoga while the carrier was operating in waters near Japan. The aircraft, its pilot Lieutenant Junior Grade Douglas Webster, and its B-43 nuclear bomb sank in approximately 16,000 feet of water and were never recovered despite search efforts. The Navy didn't publicly acknowledge the loss for years, classifying the incident and keeping the Japanese government uninformed that American forces had accidentally sunk a nuclear weapon in waters near Japanese territory that had particular sensitivity to nuclear weapons given Japan's unique history. The bomb presumably remains on the Pacific floor, along with Lieutenant Webster's remains, another permanent monument to the risks of routine nuclear weapons handling. 29. In 1961, a B-52 caught fire and broke apart over Goldsboro, Kentucky, while carrying nuclear weapons. The 5 crewmen who survived by ejecting reported that the bomb release mechanism had been damaged in the breakup, and nuclear weapons aboard had nearly fallen from the aircraft uncontrollably. Had the weapons fallen from altitude without proper safing, their condition upon impact would have depended entirely on whether safety mechanisms survived the fire and uncontrolled descent. Something that clearly wasn't guaranteed given what the Goldsboro, North Carolina incident revealed about safety system reliability. The incident was classified, and local residents never learned how close they came to potential nuclear contamination or worse. 30. In 1985, the Soviet Union nearly launched nuclear weapons in response to a solar storm that interfered with satellite communications, causing detection systems to produce garbled signals that some operators initially interpreted as possible enemy jamming preceding an attack. Solar storms cause electromagnetic interference that can disrupt radio communications, satellite operations, and radar systems. And in 1985, Soviet systems weren't well designed to distinguish between solar interference and deliberate enemy jamming. The incident led to improved procedures for distinguishing natural phenomena from attacks, but demonstrated that space weather, something completely beyond human control, could potentially trigger nuclear war if operators mistook natural interference for enemy action during a period of high tension. 31. In 1960, American early warning radar in Greenland detected what appeared to be a massive Soviet missile attack with high confidence during a period separate from the Moonrise incident. NORAD went to high alert before discovering that the radar system had been fooled by radar echoes bouncing off the moon during a period of unusual atmospheric conditions that created ducting effects. This was a separate incident from the earlier 1960 Moonrise false alarm. The moon had nearly caused nuclear war twice in the same year through two completely different mechanisms, suggesting that perhaps more attention should have been paid to how the moon interacted with detection systems before deploying those systems for nuclear warning purposes. 32. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet surface-to-air missile battery shot down an American U-2 spy plane over Cuba, killing pilot Major Rudolph Anderson, the only direct combat casualty of the crisis. President Kennedy had previously stated that any attack on American surveillance aircraft would require an immediate military response against the missile sites. The shootdown threatened to escalate the crisis into open warfare and potentially nuclear exchange. Kennedy, however, chose not to retaliate immediately, suspecting correctly that the local Soviet commander had acted without orders from Moscow, and that Khrushchev was trying to find a way out of the crisis rather than escalate it. Kennedy's restraint was controversial among his military advisors, several of whom urged immediate strikes, but his decision not to respond militarily to the shootdown prevented further escalation and helped create space for the diplomatic solution that ended the crisis days later. 33. In 1984, President Reagan made what he intended as a joke during a microphone check before a weekly radio address. "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes." Reagan didn't realize the microphone was live and being recorded, and the joke was leaked to the public shortly afterward. The Soviet Union didn't find it funny. Soviet forces were placed on brief heightened alert, while analysts tried to determine whether the joke indicated actual American intentions or revealed Reagan's true feelings about the possibility of nuclear war. Using nuclear annihilation as casual humor during a period of heightened Cold War tensions wasn't appreciated by the people who might actually have been bombed, and the incident contributed to Soviet paranoia about Reagan's intentions that was already dangerously high after the Able Archer scare the previous year. 34. In 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing all 290 people aboard, after the ship's crew misidentified the civilian Airbus A300 airliner as an attacking Iranian F-14 Tomcat fighter jet. The crew made multiple errors in identifying the aircraft, reporting it as descending and accelerating when it was actually climbing and decelerating as any civilian airliner would on departure. While not a nuclear incident, the tragedy demonstrated how military systems designed to respond quickly to threats could catastrophically misidentify targets under pressure. Had similar misidentification occurred with nuclear-armed forces during a period of heightened tensions, the response could have escalated to nuclear exchange before the error was discovered, and the target nation might never have believed it was an accident. 35. In 1967, powerful solar storms caused widespread interference with American early warning radar systems, disrupting signals in ways that some operators initially believed indicated Soviet jamming in preparation for a nuclear attack. Air Force commanders prepared to launch aircraft against the Soviet Union before space weather forecasters, scientists who studied solar activity and its effects on Earth, explained that intense solar flares were responsible for the disruptions across all frequencies and systems. The Air Force subsequently created a dedicated space weather forecasting program, specifically to prevent solar storms from accidentally triggering nuclear war, by helping operators distinguish between natural electromagnetic interference and deliberate enemy action designed to blind American defenses before an attack. 36. In 1961, during the Berlin crisis, when tensions over the divided city threatened to escalate into superpower conflict, a miscommunication between American and Soviet tanks at checkpoint. Charlie led to an armed standoff with both sides' tanks loaded, aimed at each other, and crews ready to fire across the border. American M48 Patton tanks faced Soviet T-55s at point-blank range for 16 hours, while diplomats desperately tried to negotiate a mutual withdrawal. The confrontation ended only through back-channel communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev, with both sides pulling their tanks back simultaneously to avoid the appearance of backing down. While the tanks themselves weren't nuclear-armed, the Berlin crisis was occurring against a backdrop of nuclear threats from both sides, and any shooting at Checkpoint Charlie could have escalated unpredictably into wider conflict. 37. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israel reportedly prepared nuclear weapons for possible use against advancing Egyptian and Syrian forces, when the military situation seemed desperate in the war's early days. The Soviet Union detected Israeli nuclear preparations through satellite surveillance and considered military intervention to prevent nuclear use against Arab allies. The United States, responding to Soviet military movements and statements, raised its nuclear alert level to DEFCON 3, the highest peacetime alert level, creating a secondary nuclear crisis between the superpowers within the regional conflict. The war's military situation improved for Israel with American resupply, and the nuclear dimension faded. But the incident demonstrated how regional conflicts could rapidly escalate to global nuclear confrontation, even when neither superpower initially intended escalation. 38. In 1983, a South Korean civilian airliner, Korean Airlines Flight 007, strayed into Soviet airspace and was shot down by Soviet interceptors, killing all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman. The incident occurred during a period of intense U.S.-Soviet tension and initially appeared to Western observers as deliberate Soviet aggression against innocent civilians. President Reagan called it a massacre and crime against humanity. Investigation later revealed the aircraft had drifted off course due to navigational errors. The crew had failed to switch the autopilot to inertial navigation mode, and Soviet interceptors had been unable to positively identify it as civilian in the darkness before shooting. The shootdown dramatically increased tensions at exactly the time the Able Archer exercise was creating Soviet fears about imminent American attack, making late 1983 perhaps the most dangerous period of the entire Cold War outside the Cuban Missile Crisis. 39. In 1959, a nuclear-armed B-47 bomber caught fire at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana during ground operations. Firefighters battled the blaze while nuclear weapons remained aboard the burning aircraft, aware that their fire suppression efforts might trigger detonation, but unable to simply let the aircraft burn uncontrolled. The weapons didn't detonate, but the incident demonstrated that ground fires could threaten nuclear weapons as easily as in-flight emergencies, and that base personnel might face impossible choices between fighting fires and avoiding nuclear explosions. The Air Force's response was to improve fire response procedures and develop fire-resistant containers for nuclear weapons, rather than question whether keeping nuclear weapons in fire-prone environments was wise policy. 40. In 1957, an American B-47 accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb near Albuquerque, New Mexico, while at 1,700 feet altitude. The conventional explosives detonated on impact, creating a crater 25 feet deep and 12 feet wide. The nuclear core wasn't installed, so no nuclear explosion occurred, but the crater was just 4.5 miles from the Kirtland Air Force Base Control Tower. The Air Force had dropped a nuclear bomb within sight of one of its own bases through simple handling error. 41. In 2007, 6 nuclear cruise missiles were accidentally loaded onto a B-52 and flown from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, without anyone realizing the aircraft was carrying live nuclear weapons. The missiles sat unguarded on the runway at Barksdale for 9 hours before anyone noticed they were armed with nuclear warheads. The incident resulted in the firing of the Air Force Secretary and Chief of Staff, and demonstrated that even modern nuclear safety systems could completely fail through routine procedural errors. 42. In 1969, North Korea shot down an American EC-121 reconnaissance aircraft, killing all 31 crew members. President Nixon seriously considered nuclear retaliation, and American forces prepared tactical nuclear weapons for potential strikes against North Korean targets. Nixon was eventually talked out of nuclear response by advisors who argued the political cost would outweigh any military benefit. The incident demonstrated that minor regional powers could provoke nuclear-armed states into considering nuclear use. 43. In 1971, President Nixon, reportedly intoxicated, ordered a nuclear strike on North Korea after they shot down a helicopter. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger intercepted the order and told military commanders to hold off until Nixon sobered up. Nixon apparently didn't remember issuing the order when he woke up. The incident, which remained classified for decades, demonstrated that American Nuclear Launch Authority ultimately rested with a single individual who could issue orders while impaired. 44. In 1974, a fire at a Soviet missile base in the Ural Mountains threatened nuclear weapons stored at the facility. The extent of the incident remains classified, but Soviet nuclear safety was generally acknowledged to be less rigorous than American standards throughout the Cold War. Multiple Soviet nuclear submarine accidents, missile explosions, and facility fires created ongoing risks of accidental detonation or uncontrolled release of nuclear material that the Soviet government worked hard to conceal. 45. And finally, throughout the entire Cold War, both American and Soviet nuclear forces operated under launch-on-warning doctrines that required them to launch retaliatory strikes before incoming missiles could destroy their forces, meaning they had to decide whether to end civilization based on early warning systems that repeatedly malfunctioned. Every false alarm described in this video occurred within systems designed to launch world-ending retaliation within minutes. The officials responsible for making launch decisions had to trust computers, radar, satellites, and communication systems that failed regularly while knowing that hesitation during an actual attack would mean their own annihilation. The entire Cold War was a continuous nuclear close call, a 45-year period during which human survival depended on fallible systems operated by fallible humans, never making the same mistake at the same time. We survived not because the systems worked, but because individuals like Stanislav Petrov and Vasily Arkhipov decided in critical moments that their systems were wrong and their orders shouldn't be followed. The world exists today because a few people had the courage to second-guess computers telling them to launch nuclear war, and we were lucky that those people were on duty when the false alarms happened. Every moment of every day during the Cold War, the fate of human civilization depended on the assumption that when machines told humans to end the world, humans would be wise enough to question the machines. That assumption was tested dozens of times, and we passed not through good design, but through good fortune and individual courage. Here's the brutal truth about nuclear close calls. We've come within minutes of extinction multiple times because of computer chips, weather, bears, the moon, and simple human error. The systems designed to prevent nuclear war have repeatedly almost caused it, and the safety mechanisms we trust have failed far more often than most people realize. The real nuclear deterrent was the individual officers who questioned orders along the way. Every false alarm that didn't end in nuclear war represents a moment when someone decided not to follow their training, not to trust their systems, and not to launch. History's lesson is clear. Nuclear weapons have nearly killed us all repeatedly, and we've survived through luck rather than design. The same systems that protect us could destroy us if the wrong person is on duty when the next false alarm occurs. Subscribe if you appreciate still being alive, and remember that somewhere right now, someone is watching a screen that could show a false alarm at any moment, and our continued existence depends on their judgment being better than their equipment.